Hi, I'm Jess Fields. Welcome to the show. As a result of protests stemming from the death of George Floyd, you may have heard the term Antifa thrown around recently. But what is Antifa, and who is Antifa? President Donald Trump recently announced that he would declare Antifa a terrorist organization, although it's not clear how he plans to do so. What is clear is that few understand what Antifa is or why they are, other than that they are part of the far left and that they have some role, whether small or big, in the protests. Now, this warranted further investigation, and that's why the other day I interviewed two individuals from what might be called Antifa in the Denver area, although it's also known as anti-capitalism and anti-fascism, and they prefer probably the term anti-capitalism themselves. They are a man and woman, each in their early 20s. The man wished to be called S, and the woman wished to be called H. Both self-identify as communists and advocate for nothing less than complete political and social revolution in the United States. To that end, they endorse tactics that the majority of society rejects, such as property damage and looting, which they refer to as reclamation. They're also armed, and if you watch the video of this interview as opposed to hearing the podcast, you'll notice an AK-47 leaning against the wall behind them. The organization that S founded is called the Rocky Mountain Youth Liberation Front, or YLF. There are numerous YLF organizations throughout the United States, but broadly speaking, they tend to be localized groups and not highly organized entities. These groups seek to help their members communicate with one another and provide support during their activities and during protests. For example, S and H have both served as medics during the protests. The group is also highly decentralized, as you will hear S explain, and they carefully vet who they allow to be involved and who they trust. This is why, according to him, his group and others like it are harder to infiltrate than such organized groups as the Democratic Socialists of America, which is a 501c3 entity and which he believes is full of infiltrators who are looking for criminal activity. It's also why it may be difficult for anyone to pin down, quote, Antifa as a single entity, because it is in fact many entities, many different entities, which are highly decentralized and distributed. Ultimately, as you will hear described, what the Rocky Mountain YLF and other such groups seek is to have enough power to cause revolutionary change in the governing structures and institutions of the United States. For them, presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden is virtually the same as President Donald Trump, because both, according to S and H, continue to endorse and defend the capitalist system that they would like to see overthrown. Now it's time for a brief disclaimer. As I've often done during my interviews and will probably do again, I wish to remind the listener that an interview is not an endorsement, and I do not necessarily subscribe to everything or anything that a particular guest says. Instead, I ask questions to learn as much as possible about what someone believes, and more importantly, why. In our modern age of hyper-partisan media, I realize that it's rare for an interviewer to maintain a sense of aloofness from a guest in this way. But please do not construe my questioning or curiosity as in any way an endorsement of anything that any of my guests say. In this case, I feel compelled to point out that, obviously, I do not endorse criminal activity, but that doesn't mean that this issue and this growing movement shouldn't be reported on, and that you shouldn't be allowed to consider it for yourself, and that you're not smart enough to evaluate things for yourself. The information does deserve to be out there. For that matter, I think you will find this to be a very interesting and very informative interview with two individuals involved in what is commonly called Antifa or anti-fascism, anti-capitalism. Their names are S and H from the Rocky Mountain YLF in the Denver area of Colorado, and the interview begins now. Joining me now are two activists from the Rocky Mountain Youth Liberation Front in the Denver area of Colorado. They're in their early 20s, and they would prefer to be identified only as H, she is on the left on the screen, and S, who is on the right. And they would self-identify as anti-capitalists, anti fascists, or maybe Antifa, as some would say, and certainly YLF movement individuals, which is a broader movement. Thank you both for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
So let's go ahead and I guess just go back through real quick your background and where did you grow up? What brought you to being involved with YLF, with anti-capitalism, anti-fascism, etc.?
Yeah, so I'm a Colorado native. I was first introduced to left-wing politics through Bernie's 2016 campaign. And then beyond that, it really took just some education. I was first introduced to Marx through philosophy, and from there it's just been kind of a snowballing of getting more and more involved with things until I'm doing more than I can possibly do. So.
Yeah, I think I was kind of similar in terms of first being introduced through the Bernie campaign to leftist politics as kind of a whole. I mostly specialize in like school and professionally in like biology and environmental science. So a lot of my motivation, especially initially, was the fact that there's really not any way to have a world that allows for the survival of humans and animals that isn't like Marxist, essentially. In addition to that, I was raised Catholic and was kind of introduced to like the Catholic workers movement and liberation theology and such. And that kind of influenced sort of my view of like what's important in the world.
Yeah, so would you guys say that you mentioned Catholic, would you guys say you have any particular religious belief or views that inform you now, or?
I mean, I would say I'm like culturally Catholic. I think that overall, most people within our movement and milieu are either sort of actual atheists or kind of vaguely spiritual. It's definitely a diverse group of people in terms of their beliefs.
Yep.
Does this sound right? So S, would you say you're atheist or agnostic, or?
I'm in a similar boat with it. Do take some cultural Catholicism with me, maybe not quite to the same extent, but we're a generally non-religious movement, but there are definitely a diversity of opinions and beliefs within it.
So I guess you mentioned the Bernie campaign. Was there a particular moment for each of you when you just said, we have to get much more involved and do something more drastic, more involved than just, voting or going to rallies or whatever? I mean, at what point for each of you was kind of the turning point in your lives?
I think for me, kind of the big thing was realizing that just one campaign is not going to be enough, that the problems that I'm, starting to see, starting to learn about, that these go very deep, that can be solved in one go, and they're not just things that can be solved without a complete change in our political system, in revolutionary action.
Yeah, I think after 2016, I was like most people, not having a great time. And I found out about the DSA, got involved in the DSA, and it definitely helps connect. Like, it really helps you understand that all of the issues that you're kind of introduced to as like these separate problems, like housing and healthcare and low wages and just about every other thing, they're not separate. It's one problem. It's essentially one solution. Ever since then, I've just been kind of more and more embedded in this stuff. And as we work on more campaigns, like especially electorally, especially like at the beginning of last year, and the Bernie Sanders campaign is getting fired up again, we decided to throw every possible thing we can into that, because if there's even 1% chance that we could really improve things, then it's worth it. But it was always our philosophy while we were involved with the campaign, is that like this is a part of a larger strategy, and we have to continue building upon it, whether or not it works out electorally or not.
So H, you mentioned the DSA. For those that are not familiar, that are listening or watching, the DSA is the Democratic Socialists of America, correct? So could you just kind of describe, I guess, where that fits into the picture? Because then I want you to kind of also describe, what is YLF? What is Youth Liberation Front? There certainly is not just one. There are a number of groups that go by that, but also maybe kind of describe, is this really more is YLF more organized, or is it more of kind of a joint collective of individuals at the local level? Kind of what is the relationship to DSA, and then what is YLF?
So to start with our relationship to the DSA, I should preface all of this by saying both within the DSA and within the YLF, there are a huge diversity of opinions on everything. There's no monolith for everything. There's no monolith for anything on the left. You get two leftists in a room, they're gonna find something to argue about.
For better or worse.
Yeah, but kind of the logic when founding the Rocky Mountain Youth Liberation Front was that there are limitations to the DSA, and those limitations, at least as far as we are concerned, are mainly tactical. Like it's a legally recognized nonprofit. You can't have something like that going off and like organizing blocks at protests and having its members engaging in these things that might be kind of gray areas legally, that just a lot of stuff that wouldn't be acceptable for that type of organization.
Well, in part because it is a big tent socialist organization. It has a lot of different people with a lot of different opinions, and it also has a national structure that is voted in. And so they have conventions and various ways of voting for that stuff that is very cool because it's democratic, but it's very slow, and there is a level of centralization.
So before you guys describe the YLF, just to kind of clarify though, what you're saying is the Democratic Socialists of America, it is a large political entity, as you say, 501c3, and it has even relatively high profile office holders who are unafraid of saying that they affiliate with the DSA, but that it really doesn't go far enough in action for some folks who obviously decided, hey, there's more needed. And is that maybe where YLF comes in? And then could you describe kind of how that is?
Yeah, that's exactly where YLF comes in, where we recognize these tactical limitations. And because of that, we have formed an independent collective. And so, like you mentioned earlier, the YLF is a nationally reaching label. I wouldn't even call it an organization because the structure is with autonomous collectives, where in every given city or region, you will have a collective like we have ours here. And those will generally engage in local issues and issues centering around direct action. So that is like what's going on across the country now with the protests, a lot of things like that, a lot of engaging directly with members of the far right, generally is kind of who we've found ourselves up against in the past few years of having the YLF around. But now obviously it's a lot more worrying about the police, worrying about police violence, keeping all our members safe. And our role, especially here, I don't want to speak too heavily for our other chapters, as they are all autonomous. They're, the actual character, the shape of them varies, and it varies depending on all who's in them, where they are, what they need to do. But especially for us here, our primary role is to be a support infrastructure where we give our members a method of communication so that we can identify needs, we can identify when people are offering things, we can share information. And through doing that, we can be better organized, be able to keep each other safe, be able to more effectively accomplish our political goals. And we also work very heavily in coordinating with other organizations um, doing a lot of the same stuff, doing that information sharing, needs, wants, all that stuff. And like there is probably close to 100% overlap where almost all of our members are also members of other organizations, and they're oftentimes members of organizations geared towards specific things, where you do have like, you can say like, okay, I'm in this group to accomplish this purpose, for this role, and we try to fit into that, where we can have our specific role and know that, okay, we have these things we do, we have these things we don't do, but we also know these other groups and these other people who can do all the things that we don't do.
Like, for example, there's also, in addition to the DSA and the Denver DSA, there's also the like the campus-focused Auraria Young Democratic Socialists of America. And so, while they may focus more on, campus-specific organizing, including like labor, we can help get some of their membership more involved in other sorts of forms of direct action as well, that isn't directly affiliated with their purposes.
So I definitely want to understand membership, and I want to understand kind of how that direct action takes effect. But I do want to ask, I mean, in terms of, so not being like an actual organization, or not having, so like the Democratic Socialists of America, or really any political 501c3, right? They have, board of directors, they can receive contributions, they can expend, they have to report all these things to the government. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into that. It sounds like that if there are resources being shared, but that it takes place maybe in a more, I guess, is it fair to say loosely organized? Or, I mean, how does an organization like YLF function? How do the organizations function without having the formal entities maybe involved to distribute resources?
So a lot of it is very network based. We're going to be talking about, having things very, very direct, very horizontal organization, because there isn't a formal command structure. A lot of it is done through, you have like one point of contact that can talk to other people in other places, maintain security, but everything is still done in a kind of network form, which is, yes, it's more loosely organized. It's something that may not be quite as effective when you're like actually trying to kind of be the primary organizers, the primary leaders of whatever project you're trying to accomplish. But when you're doing very localized things and kind of more support action, it's can be very beneficial, because it makes for a lot quicker communication. It makes us far more resistant to any sort of outside pressure, whether that be any state actors, non-state actors trying to infiltrate, trying to cause chaos, trying to get information out. The decentralized nature really protects us against that, and it protects our members' safety.
So there's not one overarching organization maybe to be compromised. It sounds like is what you're.
That's correct. Like,
okay.
we all have contact with each other. I generally know what's going on. We do coordination in specific instances across the country. We talk with each other, but there's no one person or even one structure that you could take down and it would take down the entire thing. You'd have to go through and take out every single chapter, even down to every single part of every single chapter, to fully dismantle us. And that's something that's very hard to do.
So it's a very decentralized structure. I'm curious though, like when it comes to actually, even as decentralized as it is, obviously there still have to be some resources. I mean, are there like, I don't know, businesses or wealthy individuals who help fund things? Or is it like every person just kind of comes in and brings whatever they've got to the table? Or how does it work?
Yeah, we do not have any any Soros money. We don't have any outside help financially, logistically, really anything. We do operate on from each according to his ability to each according to his need, where we contribute what we can for each other, we take what we need, and we are a self-sufficient and a self-sustaining collective and structure.
So in terms of where the members come from, I mean, I think you've already kind of alluded to, there certainly is probably a little bit of a youth slant in the membership. Would that be fair to say, or younger slant?
Yeah, we generally try to have our members at least in their 20s or younger. I'd say the average age is probably somewhere around 20, 21, something like that.
So let's say that somebody was in downtown Denver and they were walking around, they were going to shops and restaurants and bars, et cetera, and just kind of, going and talking to different, young people maybe working in downtown Denver. I mean, would they run across members of YLF without knowing it? Do YLF members participate in society in that way? Are these just, your membership just average people that are, or is it mostly like, students or I guess, where is the societal aspect to the membership, I guess? What, is it just basically anybody off the street, anybody in any normal position, like you engage with somebody and that they might be YLF, but maybe they wouldn't tell you that?
Yeah, that's I'd say that's accurate. We have membership from a lot of different places. Probably the majority of us are students, but definitely not all. It is one of those things where, yeah, even like one of us might run into a fellow member, not even realize it. I've definitely had plenty of times at different protests and stuff like that where I've like been, standing next to somebody and not even realize that it was them, because we do kind of have a level of anonymity. But yeah, we're just generally just normal people, students, workers. All of us, of course, have a working class background to some extent or another. And when I say working class, I mean in kind of the Marxist sense of like, we don't own businesses. Like, it doesn't necessarily mean we're all poor or really have any bearing on income, family income, anything like that. But we don't own things. We work for people. We're all working class in that way.
Yeah, but we're very normal. We talk like normal people. Do normal things.
So yeah, I mean, I want to ask you about anonymity, and of course, you guys are both wearing face coverings. But in terms of especially we're in the aftermath of the George Floyd protests and all of that going on. I mean, what is the racial background of the organization? I mean, is it fairly diverse? Is it mostly, Caucasian? Is it, what's the background of that?
Well, so being in Colorado, we are a very white state. And I think that does reflect on our kind of racial or ethnic makeup. But that being said, we do have, I'd say, a good diverse group. We have, people with indigenous backgrounds, people with Latino backgrounds. So we're definitely not an all-white group by any means.
So in terms of anonymity, I mean, obviously you can see the face coverings and there's a certain amount of anonymity here. What is the role of anonymity for those that are in YLF, or let's say any anti-fascist, any anti-capitalist organization that is doing direct action, which we'll talk about? But I'm just curious, what's the anonymity factor? I mean, is that everyone pretty much is anonymous, or is it just some people choose to be and some people are unafraid to say it publicly, or what's the anonymity?
Generally, we try to maintain anonymity across the board. It is, of course, a security thing, where in this line of action, it can be legally risky. You can have people who are non-state actors on the far right coming after you, which is a thing that happens fairly frequently. And of course, they like to dox us. They like to attack us. And it's also one of those things kind of on a more collective level where the more people that maintain anonymity, the harder it is to pick out certain ones. Like it's the black bloc logic where, you know, if everybody looks the same, then you're going to have a much harder time picking out a single person.
So,
And
as just to kind of provide clarity for anybody listening or watching, you said doxing by certain members of people on the right. When you say doxing, could you explain what that means?
yeah, so doxing is essentially the process of publicly releasing someone's private information. Usually that means stuff like full name, address, employer, like can be where they go to school, really anything that could.
It can be family's information.
Yeah,
as well.
family's information. And that is it's a political tactic, and it's one used by both sides. There are a lot of people on the left who use it, and the right also uses it. We've seen stuff like Atomwaffen Division, at least formally one of kind of the premier neo-Nazi militant organization, like having members going outside of a man's home to intimidate him and his family, even though it was actually the wrong man, which is one of the dangers of doxing.
They're not great.
But yeah, like not too long ago, we had some of our local kind of far-right militants, including former Proud Boy Louis Huey, who's a local fixture here in Denver, with his friends. Oh, who were they? Oh, can't remember. But with his friends, they went to one of our local reporters' house to intimidate him while he had his, wife and infant child inside because they were mad about an expose that he had done. So yeah, you have a lot of stuff like that you have to worry about. And kind of the more involved you become, the more of a leader you become, the higher risk you are. Like you have some of the more high profile people within the anti-fascist movement, like Emily Gorsensky, for example, like ended up moving to Germany because she was under such active threat from these people. Like a lot of them will talk about like, I have to like concealed carry, chambered, loaded outside because I am like actively afraid for my life whenever I leave my house. Like that is the level that it gets to once you start to have any sort of prominence, once you start to become a target. And even before that level, there is a threat here. And that threat does come, from the far right, from non-state actors, but we do also have to contend with state actors, whether that be like, the FBI or police, where they, regardless of whether we're actually doing anything illegal, they want to be monitoring us. They want to break up our organization. Like we've seen it with COINTELPRO. We've seen how effective it can be when you have infiltration, when you expose people, when you break up movements. It will kill them. It will kill entire generations of movements.
Well, and this is also part of the utility of having the YLF as a distinct unit from something like the DSA, where the DSA is heavily infiltrated, and they also try to stay away from certain topics like, maybe gun control and gun ownership that might make them even more of a target for like state infiltration. And so existing as a separate unit, if we wanted to talk about some of those subjects, it's a bit safer.
Yeah. And with the YLF, like something like the DSA, there is not really much of a vetting process. Like if you are an infiltrator, it's fairly easy to get in, but here we can have our own standards and procedures to help ensure that at least the bad infiltrators are caught, right? And we have kind of some sort of base of knowledge of, okay, who are the people that we are organizing with? What level do we trust them? What level does everyone trust each other? And kind of controlling the information sharing and being able to maintain a higher level of operational security with that.
So there's a lot there. I guess one additional question here on the security aspect is, now obviously we're talking right now over a video conferencing. I mean, to what extent do you believe or think or know that, say, you mentioned state actors, so I'm guessing local, state, and federal government. I mean, is monitoring or trying to monitor your communications, your whereabouts, I mean, is that something that I'm assuming you consider on a regular basis?
Yeah, so in terms of monitoring communications, um, you just have to assume that you're always being monitored. Um, like especially with how the NSA uses dragnets and stuff like that. It you operate under the assumption that anything you sent is being read. Um, it's really hard to say, or to try to figure out the level of personal attention that law enforcement is giving, mainly because they don't have unlimited resources, and like it's a lot easier to set up a dragnet and just go through that for like key search terms than it is to be actively monitoring somebody online, and especially physically. um, but yeah, we do operate under the assumption that we are being watched, that we are being listened to in some way, or that we very easily could be. Um, but yeah, within that, it's very hard, if not impossible, to tell to what extent that actually is taking place. But it's, I would say, safe to assume that it is taking place. We are being monitored in some capacity.
H, did you want to add anything to that, or?
No, that's pretty much it. Yeah, we just try to use like secure information channels. If we need to talk about something, important or that could be sensitive, we try to do it in person. At the very least, like over a like a voice phone call that's like harder for authorities to maybe be able to do like search terms or something like that. So kind of basic stuff. Yeah.
So do you both, either of you, or let's say within YLF movements that are engaged in what some would call more radical tactics, let's say, I mean, are there any examples you have of being monitored, or things that have happened to individuals that are members or that participate in the YLF? Is that something that is a regular occurrence, or not really?
With a lot of this stuff, it's very hard to tell if you're actually being monitored. It's not quite as simple as, back in the day when you could hear the click on the phone line when they're bugging it. So I don't think I have any specific examples that would be
The
safe
closest,
to discuss, at least.
the closest I can even think of is when somebody will occasionally, like, you'll hear stories about somebody showing up to a DSA meeting and then making a joke about, like, let's go like bomb a police station on the first time you meet them. That's the cop. But
Yeah,
beyond
and
that,
because like when the police or whoever will send in infiltrators, they're never going to tell you that they're infiltrators, even if they do get kicked out. And a lot of them will just kind of be there to gather information. Sometimes it will be there to be provocateurs, to try and bait the other people into doing crimes or planning terrorist acts or whatever. But you're never gonna
yeah.
know for sure. They're never gonna like officially confirm it to you.
So let's kind of, I guess, go into, some of the tactical aspect of this, or the direct action, I think is the word that you used. What kinds of, I mean, obviously behind you, is that an AK-47?
Correct. Yeah.
So, I mean, there's definitely I guess, a more aggressive posture to what like YLF does, or what y'all are doing, as opposed to, say, Democratic Socialists of America, which is a 501c3. So what is, I mean, to say nothing about like the Democratic Party, obviously. So, I mean, you have, it's
Yeah.
kind of a spectrum. So kind of describe, if you don't mind, kind of what direct action means. Like, what is that in your view, as far as how you guys are involved in the process, what you actually do, and then we'll kind of go from there.
So direct action is a very broad term. I would almost go as far as to say it's a kind of vague term, but it generally describes the action that you take that is a direct confrontation of the issue that you want to solve. So like things like voting, writing letters to your senator, or like even posting on social media, all of that's indirect action. All of it is essentially asking to power, like, please do this thing. Direct action is when you go directly and you say, do this thing. And there is some sort of weight behind that.
It typically involves less of working within traditional channels of addressing any issues. Like I've basically heard it applied to everything that isn't electoral or on the internet, kind of. So like I've heard it applied to things like Food Not Bombs, where they're distributing food. I've heard it applied to, you know, stuff like SRA, or Socialist, Rifle Association, right? Where, you know, that they're training people maybe like how to be a responsible gun owner. And
probably the majority of instances of direct action are protests.
Yes.
Stuff like that, where you are getting out and directly.
Well, I've also heard it applied to like some of our local efforts to address like COVID related problems, like you know, trying to set up networks to help get people food and like medical supplies while they're in isolation. So it's a lot of like building alternate channels to support each other and your organizing efforts.
So, so I guess let's go and talk about, so starting with protests, because obviously we're in the middle of a couple of weeks of rather widespread protests, and widely reported as perhaps the most widespread protests in the United States in 40, 50 years, going back to the civil rights movement or even before that. So in terms of protests, I mean, when YLF gets involved in protests, we're not just talking about waving signs around, are we? What exactly does that look like? And kind of maybe detail some of that type of involvement. What is the goal of being involved in that way or going out at that time?
Yeah, so kind of like I was saying earlier, the purpose of our chapter specifically, which again can vary some by chapters, is to be primarily a support network where, we're not just going out and waving signs. We're making sure that people have transportation, that people have food, that people have water, that people can get medical attention, and that we know what's going on so that we can coordinate, we can share information with each other. Really all with the goal being, first and foremost, keeping our members safe, keeping everyone else in the protest safe, and secondly, accomplishing our political goals of what we want to get done with the protest.
Yeah, a lot of, I think, you know, what we do and what we try to, you know, help people learn how to do is like, you know, security for more traditional protests, but also for this one as well, and also marshaling and also some medicing. We've been doing a lot of medicing, two of us.
So I guess let's go into maybe just talking about certain specific methods, like in terms of, for example, you know, one thing that has been, I guess, seen in some of these protests, certainly not everyone, but in some of the protests, there has been vandalism, property damage. Do you believe that has a political utility, or is that not something that is valuable to you?
There is a political utility to it, yeah. And it's, I would almost say it's more of a strategic than directly political, at least in what we have in Denver, to a very limited extent, where it is just kind of what would be described as, you know, looting, where it, in the immediate, in the short term, it has the effect of spreading police forces thin, because the role of the police is primarily to protect property. And when property is being attacked and threatened on a large scale, they're going to have to deploy in a lot more places. That makes it much harder for them to deploy en masse, to be able to kettle, where they essentially will surround protesters and be able to arrest them all. Of course, also using that often as an excuse for violence, where they can tear gas and shoot rubber bullets and no one can run away. So that makes it a lot harder for them to do that. And it can also act on a more political level as it's a reclamation of the value of our labor that's been stolen from us. It's a reclamation of the public space that has been stolen from us. And
yeah, I think on a strategic level, because, the primary role of police is to protect property. And we are in a society in which people as a whole value property above human safety and life. Attacking property is by far the best way to get people to listen. It's actually much more effective than hurting people or laying down and being hurt. So it has both strategic and political value, I think.
Yeah, and it also serves to reassert the fact that the working class has power.
Yes.
It shows both the government and business owners, what we would call the capitalist class, capitalists. It shows them
the limitations.
It shows them their limitations. It shows them that they should be afraid of working people. That when we decide that we have power, that we built this, we can destroy it.
So what, I guess, are some, I mean, obviously we've had now a couple of weeks of protests. What are maybe some examples of property damage, that kind of thing that has occurred during that period that that maybe you guys are familiar with or have participated in, that you feel like is valuable towards that aim of making that point, or I mean, it's kind of several points, but I mean, what is I guess, what are some examples of what you feel like is a good example of that, of that kind of thing?
I think a lot of the graffiti on the Capitol right now is pretty poignant.
Talking about the Capitol in Colorado.
Yeah, on the Capitol building, on the statues surrounding it, that say things like Black Lives Matter, or fuck the police or fuck 12, stuff like that. The fact that that's on these buildings that are supposed to represent the state power is important. People see it, people notice it, they try to cover it up very fast. Yeah.
And here in Denver, there, at least as far as we've been around for, there really hasn't been all that much destruction of property beyond like graffiti, most of which has been on the boards that businesses are putting up anyway.
Or on the Capitol.
Yeah.
No one has, people don't really touch the library or other institutions that have a lot of that value to all of us as normal working people. So.
Yeah. And
I think actually that was going to be my next question. You brought up like libraries and things like that. So I was going to say, like, in terms of like priority or hierarchy, in terms of what kinds of vandalism, property damage are most effectual in your view, what kinds of things would somebody want to, if they were trying to do what you're trying to do, what kinds of things are prioritized as far as damage goes? I mean, it sounds like libraries would be no. I mean, but like, for example, I think in Minneapolis specifically, in the precinct where, I want to say in Minneapolis, where the precinct where Derek Chauvin was a police officer, I believe they actually destroyed the precinct police station. Like, for example, would that be something that you would prioritize, or just kind of list out, I guess, what?
To be clear, we aren't directing any of this. We are really, right now, we're just describing organically what has been occurring around us, and what we're watching people move towards. And I think that it does actually naturally align with our values conveniently. It turns out the things that we value are the things that everybody else also values. So I think police stations, centers of state power, like the Capitol building itself, buildings like the Amazon warehouses that people have started burning down, where these are very low paying, very abusive jobs that have
even
havoc on our communities.
Yeah, and even like the buildings of large corporations and big box stores like Target and
Yes.
Walmart and all that. Like, yeah, these people, these businesses,
They don't belong to us.
no,
We don't control them. These aren't our communities. These
No.
are outside actors.
yeah,
that-
these are outside actors that have gone in and exploited our communities. They've hired people, you know, treated them like shit, paid them nothing. We don't owe anything to them. They owe a lot to us.
They're parasitic.
Yeah, we've made a lot of money for them, and they haven't given much back to us. If anything, they owe us. This isn't, I wouldn't even call this looting. This is reclamation.
They would have to be paying a lot more in taxes for this to be looting.
So definitely, certainly in terms of hitting a vein, it sounds like this is kind of a thing that's very important to you guys. So I guess if you could explain a little bit more about where you view these businesses' proper role in the society, as you say, what some would call looting, or many people, frankly, would call looting, but you're saying it's reclamation. Could you explain a little bit about that?
So the idea behind that statement specifically is that as workers, we produce a certain amount of value for the companies that we work for our bosses over any given period of time. We do that by our labor, right? And we are only given a fraction of that value back in the form of wages. That's kind of the most basic Marxist position. And because of that, that makes these companies parasitic, and it makes them parasitic not by kind of some like incidental attributes, some thing. It's a fundamental relationship.
It's not a matter of corruption. It's just an equation.
Yep.
So in terms of like police stations, and you mentioned the Capitol, of course, speaking in the abstract here, but I mean, is it fair to say that people who are in this movement or who are alongside you would rather see some of those institutions, some of the physical symbols, say police stations, Capitol, et cetera, I mean, you know, in some way disintegrated, you know, damaged or burned down or whatever? I mean, is there a desire to take out some of those symbols?
Well, do you mean the symbols themselves or the institutions?
Well, I suppose both. I mean, you know, a police station is both, I think, a symbol of the police in a sense, but it's also part of the institution. So I guess you can answer both sides of that.
I think in terms of institutions, in terms of symbols, taking them out is probably a universal yes. In terms of taking out the institutions themselves, that's much more complicated. I think that there's a lot of different views on how reform or abolition or some combination of the two, how that would function in terms of the police and how that would best benefit our communities. And that, you know, those disagreements are like within our organization, within all leftist organizations, within the larger BLM movement, I'm sure. That definitely exists. So that's, I think, also true of sort of the state in general. We've got, you know, members that are very much for the abolition of the state, and there's plenty of people who do believe it has a you know, could have a beneficial function
in some form.
Yeah, in some form.
So, I mean, you guys earlier identified yourselves, I believe, both as communists, being your primary viewpoint. I mean, would you say that there is a role for, let's say, the police as an institution in a society that you would want to move America towards, or is there a different role for the police that you would want to define?
So the way that we view the role of the police currently is kind of the common term is the foot soldiers of capital. Their role is to protect property, to maintain social order insofar as making sure that, you know, workers are in line, they're doing what they're supposed to do, they're not damaging property, they're not organizing. That's where you get a lot of the union busting,
Yeah.
of course, which is done by police or private police. And it's all those functions that we're really against. I don't think there's anything inherently bad about having people who are trained to be able to
respond
respond to
like
emergencies, to protect others, like that. There's kind of generally a need for some sort of organized and formalized security force in society, but we want that to be one whose role is to protect people.
And I think it's important to like understand that I'm not sure about your listenership or viewership, but within people I know of, like normal working people and my peers, there have been many times when we had to interact with the police or even called the police for help, whether we were being abused or something like that, and they have never helped. They don't fulfill the function that when people argue that it's important that we have police, they don't do that. So if they were doing that, then maybe this would be a different conversation. But the fact that they do fail to address even the most basic, I am, being harmed and I need immediate help kind of function that people could want is, I think, a pretty clear sign that something has to be changed here.
So there have been some calls nationally since these protests began for just a general disbanding of the police. Is that something that you would both suggest that you would advocate for, or?
That's complicated because what does police mean? And what does disbanding mean? If it means that the police would be, just everybody's fired and goes home, and instead we are outsourcing it to some sort of private security force on a state-by-state basis or federal whatever, not for that.
I think this may not necessarily reflect the views of the other members of our chapter, but I know both of us personally do view it that way. Really, like if you just say abolish the police and you have no other change, then you are going to end up with the Jeff Bezos private security force.
Or even anything short of extremely specific plans that would naturally be what happens. And I think what a lot of people advocate for instead is heavily decreasing police budgets, attempting to demilitarize the police. It's allocating much more of that budget towards social workers, towards schools, towards fulfilling the functions that are like a lot of the times what people do call the police for, which might be like domestic violence situations or stuff like that, where these are complicated relationships between the individuals that are involved, that you're just not like the same person that's essentially employed to protect property is not qualified to do. So it's definitely more complicated.
So you're basically, your argument is that the police now is really more about protecting property than protecting individuals.
Yeah, there's actually been a couple court cases where it was specifically stated that the police do not have an obligation to protect people.
So I guess that kind of leads into, obviously behind you is an AK-47. So, to what extent do people need to, in your view, take the law into their own hands or protect themselves, et cetera? Or, how much of this is an individual role in these times versus maybe in the ideal state that you would be advocating for?
We definitely don't advocate for vigilante justice or anything
in
like
general,
that,
the prescriptions that we advocate are never individual. So
what is, I guess, where is the role of, I guess, the use of force in this respect? Obviously having guns, you have guns for a reason.
A lot of it is as a means of community defense. We want to be organized, to be trained. Firstly, of course, to be responsible, to be safe and not harming people unintentionally. And what we do with firearms, what the left generally does with firearms, is all under the purview of the law. It's all under, the Second Amendment and everything around that. But we differ from kind of the more right-wing style of organizing in terms of defense, with our focus on collective action. I don't have a rifle because I'm afraid of burglars, right? I have a rifle because I want to protect the people around me. I want to be able to protect my community. And in exactly what way is maybe not a thing that is possible to say. Also probably not a thing that would be, all that great to go into detail on, but we want to have that ability. And we do recognize that politics is all about power, and power grows from the barrel of a gun. There is no power without violence, and the ability to do violence, whether or not that ability is acted on, can mean the ability to not only accomplish your political goals, but to stay alive, to not be killed. And that is what we are contending with. We recognize that this is fundamentally a life and death struggle. And we need to take all the tools that we can to be able to defend each other. Because we know that our only advantage is that there are far more of us than there are of them. There are far more working people than there are capitalists.
And that's also, something we get pushed on a bit sometimes in terms of like, what is the utility of owning guns when there's when the state has overwhelming weapons.
I was going to ask you, because obviously, if you're just painting in broad political terms, I think many people would say, well, somebody on the left probably opposes gun ownership, et cetera, right? And certainly there is more desire for gun control among those on the left. But of course, here, what you're doing is those who are a little bit more revolutionary or radical, might say, in your politics, you're actually suggesting that no, gun ownership is a method of reclaiming power, or is that saying that correctly? Or
it's a method of building power, certainly.
Building power. I'm sorry.
I think you would also be surprised by the amount of people that would describe themselves as on the left, as being, at the very least, pretty neutral on guns, but definitely lots of people are pro-gun ownership, whether or not they personally own guns.
Yeah, a lot of it is a division between the liberal left and the socialist, anti-capitalist left,
Illiberal.
The illiberal left. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Where, like people on the liberal left generally are not in favor of private gun ownership. But once you go far left enough that you're starting to say, okay, I'm against capitalism, then generally the opinion is gun ownership is a desirable thing. Like there's, of course, the very famous Marx quote where he's talking about how arms and ammunition shall not be surrendered under any pretense. Like we all love to quote that. Like there's a very strong tradition on the radical left of firearms advocacy, firearms ownership.
Although part of what I was saying before in terms of how we do get, some pushback in terms of, what is the utility of owning guns as like individuals when you're facing such overwhelming firepower from the state. And I think that these protests are a pretty good response to that we have the numbers, even if we show up with, bandanas and, like a water bottle to throw, like apparently that warrants, everything short of shooting live rounds at us. So even wielding, any sort of protection for ourselves, it's clearly intimidating to the state.
Yeah, and we also do have non-state actors to worry about. Like we've seen a whole bunch of examples in the past week of, like, just last night I was seeing like right-wing militia members on top of a GameStop with their rifles out. Like we have these people to worry about too, and they're more likely.
Yeah, even at the most mundane protest of like a campus speaker or something, you get people like 3%ers and Proud Boys showing up with weapons who want to threaten you.
Yeah, and we don't want to kill people. We don't want to hurt people.
No, God, no.
That's never our goal. But a lot of times the people who are directly opposed to us do. There's a lot of them who just take joy in it. Like we've seen so many examples of, police brutality towards protesters just for its own sake.
Yes.
For no actual purpose other than maybe terror.
You want to see something that happened to me while I was medicing? I've got a very fun rubber bullet mark from last weekend. Can you see that one?
So you were shot by a rubber bullet, or?
Yeah, it was a big rubber bullet, kind of the size of my fist. While I was clearly marked as a medic, trying to carry people away from tear gas.
Yeah, even Denver PD specifically they've been targeting medics. They've been beating people who are surrendering, who are also marked as medics.
Yeah. And this happened hours and hours before curfew.
Yeah. They shot at a moving car, moving away from them after the driver of that car said his pregnant girlfriend was inside.
They've shot at medic stations.
Yeah. Yeah, they shot at us when we were out.
Well, we were on private property, and we were just sitting drinking water. They shot pepper bullets at medics.
Yep.
So I mean, this kind of prompts a question. I mean, in terms of the use of force and what you're calling defense and power, really with firearms and just in general, the use of power to to have your place maybe in society in relation to the police, in relation to these other groups that you're mentioning, maybe on the other side of the political spectrum. I mean, at what point is the threshold? Where is it that threshold gets crossed? Where is the line to be crossed where you say, okay, it's time to use force? Because obviously what you're saying is you're not just going to use force willy-nilly or anytime, but there is obviously a line. Where is that line?
That's a very complex ethical question, because on the one side you do have a question of ethics, and on the other side you do also have a question of strategy, where it's like, even if you could make an ethical justification and even if you could make that justification, like it's not going to be a good turnout just to start shooting at people. Like, even if you think it's morally right, like, there's not going to be a good outcome. So you have to factor in kind of the utility of it alongside the ethics, right?
Especially because invoking any sort of violence from the state results in such overwhelming casualties for completely normal people.
Yeah.
That's a heavy choice.
So S, you mentioned, I mean, you say, whether or not it's morally right. I mean, do you think it is morally right maybe to use force in that way at times, or?
In the abstract? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it very much in the abstract. Yeah, if you and your community is being threatened, if your lives are being threatened, I do think it's morally justifiable to respond with force.
But obviously we have not seen that in the United States. There's not been an instance where in any of the protests or during the looting there's been widespread, violence in that way. But I mean, I guess is there a specific level of, let's say, police involvement or state involvement that would warrant that? For example, I've noticed that in some states there is the deploy of military forces to protest areas. I mean, is that something that you feel warrants maybe the use of power or force in a more direct way?
Well, so really the most immediate problem with that is it's going to get more innocent people killed than it would possibly save.
It's a hostage situation.
Yeah.
So is it maybe fair to say that what you're trying to do, and I know you mentioned earlier, H, that you said there's more of us than there are of them. So I mean, more anti-capitalist than capitalists. Is it fair to say that you're
more working class people?
More working class. Okay. So is it fair to say that you're trying to kind of amass enough power backed with force as well to kind of I guess change the system in that way, or kind of describe to me what is the tipping point when that change starts to occur, or at what point does the power that's wielded by the radical left, say, become enough to actually change the system?
I mean, I think that's a really difficult question, and I think that part of what complicates it in this instance, and especially like talking about it in the context of these protests, is that they don't originate from a specifically anti-capitalist voice, right? And so that's maybe not where power is amassing. We're definitely trying to help people understand that these aren't separate issues, and that the reason why Black people are being unjustly killed is it originates from it's an anti-capitalist cause, but that takes time, and it's much more complicated. So I don't know if there is a tipping point that could or will occur with this that we could maybe be on the front lines of in that way, or at least in how I see things right now. Deciding where the tipping point is in the abstract of things is always very difficult. I think that has to be something that occurs more organically. It has to be a very much like a tactical move in the moment when the opportunity occurs. So I know you have thoughts.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to ask, I mean, it is fair to say, I think, that you guys are advocating for a more revolutionary change as opposed to just an electoral change. So, okay. So in terms of that, I mean, I guess at what point, I mean, at what percentage of the population, or, at what moment do you anticipate that becoming the case? I mean, to be able to have a revolution where you have enough people on your side and enough force where you can achieve the aims that you want to achieve.
So the thing about revolutions, historically and in the abstract, is that they are the coming together of a lot of different things, an innumerable number of different things, where you need both all of the conditions to be exactly right. You need people to be mad enough to do something, people to be willing to have risk, to make sacrifices. You need the right political capital, and you also need an organization that can kind of capitalize on the anger and turn it into something instead of having it be redirected back into the current system. And when you're talking on the scale, you're talking about something so immeasurably complex that to be able to accurately predict it, you would essentially have to know everything. Like there's no way we can know exactly what it'll take. So really all we can do is try to keep building up a movement that when we hit that point, when we hit that revolutionary moment where all the factors that are there need to be, that we can capitalize on it. Because there are a lot of those moments, and maybe we're even in one now, with everything going on in the world, but with no one to capitalize on it, nothing happens.
And it gets turned back into like infighting. You know?
So I mean, I guess question one, based on what you said, well, an organization that can capitalize on it. Does the organization, in your view, exist now that could kind of become the spearhead or the front for that change, for that revolutionary change that you're advocating for, or would it have to be created at some point?
I think probably not. It probably does not exist.
No.
And so then I guess the second part of that would be, so is it fair to say that you do view this moment as potentially, obviously maybe you don't know at this point, it doesn't sound like, but potentially part of creating that inertia for the change?
Yeah, I think it can be a shift in momentum and a symbolic shift that could lead to some sort of revolutionary, not even moment, but movement at some point down the line. I don't think this in itself is, but there's, I think, undeniable potential here.
So I guess in terms of, like, let's talk about specifically the issues surrounding George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and these situations that have been called by many police brutality. mean, what is your general response to that? I mean, what is the, I guess the response that you would have in the sense of the issues that that brings up, and maybe the opportunity that you maybe seem to sense in terms of what you want to achieve on a larger scale, politically, socially?
Well, as anti-capitalists, I think we have to relate it back to that, just like we have to relate really all political injustices back to that. We want to encourage a view that instead of taking issues individually, taking them in a vacuum, recognizes the interconnectedness of everything political. That racism is not a separate issue from capitalism, is not a separate issue from the police or anything else. All of the oppressions that we talk about, they are all related, and they are all in a way secondary, and they all come from capital. It is capital that allows them to propagate, to flourish, to expand.
They're symptoms.
They're symptoms, yeah.
And thus,
and they're tools.
Yeah, whatever answer that people provide has to challenge capitalism fundamentally. It's like I'm sure you've seen some of the like 8 reforms that people are advocating for that mostly amount to do more paperwork for the cops because they don't really challenge anything.
Yeah, and there are defensive mechanisms that capitalism has to maintain its power, to maintain the class control of the capitalist class.
And that includes advocating for and allowing for minor reforms like this that allow for a little more paperwork that they feel like could diffuse all of this tension. And it's important that people don't cede to that.
Yeah, it's a matter of controlled dissent, where, yeah, what all this is, a lot of these kind of liberal attempts now that we've seen the spontaneous uprising, we've seen Minneapolis. That's what happens when the working class is in control, and that is in a very organic, very spontaneous way.
When they fail to diffuse the tension.
Yeah, and what we're seeing now, as things kind of turn more peaceful, we get all these calls for reforms, is that is in a way a reassertion of capital, where they're attempting to regain control of the narrative of what can be said in the discourse, what potential solutions and remedies there are.
And that includes like the police and mayors and such marching alongside protesters or kneeling. It's allowing a very specific kind of dissent. It's about playing nice, and people should not settle for it. It won't do anything.
So really, if I can try to restate maybe what you're saying, or just try to understand it a little bit better here, you're saying that instead of playing the game, that a lot of people on the left are playing the wrong game, or shouldn't be playing the game?
I mean, if you're talking about like the game being
I mean, politics or political compromise or proposing political solutions, it sounds like you're saying none of that would work.
When you say political, what we think of as political, I think, is broader than electoral politics.
Okay, fair enough.
We do think that there's a role for electoral politics. It's just clear that that's not all that can or should exist.
Well, let's say public policy solutions, and then these gestures. You say kneeling, the police kneeling. I mean, what I hear you saying is that really is just reinforcing capitalism. Is that correct? Or
yeah, there is this anger, this frustration, and it has to be directed somewhere, right? And so initially it has, of course, been directed at the 3rd precinct. It's been directed at Target. It's been directed actually at like the actual enemies, because people just kind of have an unconscious sense of what's keeping them down.
People instinctively do have an understanding of power. It's not until someone else comes in and tells them that they need to focus their efforts somewhere else that's taken away.
Yeah.
So instead we have to channel that right back towards where it actually should be.
Yeah, and like all the examples that we've brought up of the gestures and the policy reforms, They are ways of controlling what acceptable change is. They control the dialogue. They say, this is what you can say, this is what you can't say. And the things that you can't say are not going to be threatening. Or, sorry, I think I misspoke there. The things that you can say are not going to be threatening. Because why would the people in power let you say the things that are threatening to them?
In terms of prescription, I think that there are some things that maybe you would, or like someone could term as reform, like, yeah, taking away just a massive chunk of police budgets that would be useful. That, you know, like that's obviously outside of just go down and like, yeah, burn down the police station. But I do think that accomplishing that can't be achieved through just elect like progressive prosecutors.
Yeah.
You have to force their hand.
Yeah, and all the real gains that we do through that kind of acceptable, all those acceptable methods are going to be marginal. They're not going to solve police brutality. They're not going to stop racism, because racism is a product of the fundamental mechanisms that govern our life. And if you don't take away those mechanisms, if you don't cut them out at the root, they're just going to reassert themselves. They're going to reassert themselves in different ways, maybe, but they'll still be there. They'll still have the same function. Like racism has been built historically, especially in America, as a way of keeping the working class divided, where they made it in even as early as like the late 1600s. The colonists found that there was too much potential for solidarity between poor whites and blacks. And so they made it specifically, explicitly, to where the lowest white man is higher than the highest black man. And in that way, you break solidarity, because you have these people who are fundamentally the same. They have the same interests. They want the same things. They're both working people. Well, one of them is black, one of them is white. They aren't going to work with each other. And like that's where like the potential of like groups like the Black Panthers came in, of where they recognize that. They recognize that, okay, we're black people, but we share a common struggle with white people, with Asian people, with Native American people. Like that was what Fred Hampton said. He said, we have to recognize that there is an illness in the masses, and that's the white masses, the black masses, the yellow masses, all the masses. We're all working class, and what racism does is it hides that fact. And even if we break down racism as we know it, there are still going to be tools that are organically developed by capital to break that solidarity.
So I want to ask you for reaction on something, because you mentioned a few times that business owners are part of the enemy in your view. And again, is that fair to say? I mean, y'all mentioned that.
It's more complicated than that in terms of, yeah,
okay.
Obviously someone who, you know, like has a, you know, business at home making bracelets or something is not in the same position as Jeff Bezos.
Not in the Jeff Bezos. So fair enough. So I had interviewed very recently, about a week ago, a lady named Maya Santa Maria in Minneapolis. She employed actually both George Floyd and Derek Chauvin at her nightclub. Now, she had the business where she had owned that business and also had her radio equipment and so forth. That was burned down on Lake Street in Minneapolis. And that was, of course, the center of the precinct there, and she actually described that the police had pulled out of the precinct, and she described that a number of ethnic businesses there on Lake Street, that was kind of an enclave for ethnic businesses in South Minneapolis, and that many of them had indeed been burned or damaged or vandalized, so forth. I mean, I guess she had a view that was problematic, that went too far. So, I mean, I guess what would be your response to that? Because, you know, she was certainly maybe supportive of the protest, but didn't go as far as to endorse some of these other tactics that were used by certain protesters, people rioting and looting.
So there's a kind of a question that comes up here, especially when you're talking about the interactions between race and class, where, yes, we do believe Black Lives Matter. Of course, we support that. We put out there. But our foremost solidarity, our foremost duty is to our class, is to fellow working people. And that does mean just logically that we have to place that ahead of racial issues in some way, of where there comes a time like what you just described where you have to decide, either do I care more that this person is a a racial and ethnic minority, an oppressed identity in some way, or do I care that they're a capitalist? Like, which one am I going to put first? And we say we do the latter. We put our class first because we recognize that race is constructed. It's not an innate thing. It's not something that has always been. It hasn't even been in the form that we know it for a very long time historically. That's all constructed, that's all artificial, and it's all a tool that works against us. But our class is something real. Our relationship to property, to ownership, that's not something that's arbitrary, that can change for political tools. That's real. And because of that, we have real interests. Like, my interests are with the people of my class. Like, I don't share the same interests as a rich capitalist white person, right? Or a rich capitalist white man. Because even though we can maybe share some of the same identities, we don't really have anything in common. We don't have anything material in common, especially not when compared to a poor Black trans woman who's also a fellow member of the working class. I have far more in common with that person than I ever will the white guy, right? Despite the fact that I look more similar to him.
So, I mean, so to clarify, that what Ms. Santa Maria had talked about a little bit, and I think, maybe a question would be, so, I mean, in terms of whether a business is owned by, let's say, a person of color, or a group that maybe has, some would say, fewer economic opportunities, you're saying that is not as relevant as the class distinction. Is that fair?
Yeah, but also no one's keeping a hierarchy in their head of which business do we burn first. It's about proximity. It's where the people are. The people who burn that, I don't know everything about the situation, but my understanding is that was their community. If that was strategically and tactically what they felt needed to be done, it's that's their choice to do that. And then, they don't owe anything to the business owners.
One thing that she mentioned in that interview would be, she said that the people who were burning down the businesses, who were vandalizing, property damage, that was people that were not from the community. They were coming from outside. So I don't know, obviously.
Well, that's more complicated, because there have been a lot of claims of people being outside agitators, right, or such, that aren't true. They're just actually not true. And
it's also metro areas are a thing. For our situation, Denver is a city where Denver proper has, I think, 500,000-600,000 residents, but the Denver metro area has 3 million.
Right.
It's
very big.
If you hear stuff about outside protesters coming in from Denver, they're coming in from Aurora, they're coming in from Lakewood, from Wheat Ridge. These are all still working class, still Denver neighborhoods.
There are people who commute here anyways.
Yeah.
They're not outside agitators, as it's been very explicitly framed by the police. And so it's not that she was lying or something. That is what, I'm sure that's what she's been told, whether or not that is actually true.
Well, let me ask you, so you mentioned Aurora. I mean, I'm somewhat familiar with Denver. I'm not as familiar, obviously, as you guys are living there. But in terms of Aurora, I mean, this is a suburb of Denver. I mean, why not focus let's say somebody lives in Aurora, why would they not go and try to do some of this direct action, do some of these things in Aurora, as opposed to maybe going to Denver? Or is there a different time, different place for that kind of activism in a more localized community? Or is it, as you mentioned, that where the people are? I mean, what is the kind of the determining factor about where these things take place?
in this situation, it is just where the people are. Like, nobody is in Aurora or any of the other suburbs. Everybody is down at the Capitol. Like that, it's just kind of the natural, spontaneous
Well,
place where we are.
it's also where symbolic power is. It's the Capitol building. Yeah, I think there maybe are some people organizing in Boulder and Aurora, but yeah, even though the Aurora police are famously awful.
And we have done stuff out there before.
Yeah, but it's just easier to confront power where it's centralized in the same way it's easier to confront power where other people are for you to organize with. It's also hard to be the individual who organizes a gathering, even if like you live there and that's what you want to do. It is easier to just organically go to where all your friends are going.
So, and like Aurora police are out here.
Oh,
like, we're seeing them.
We have police from I've seen many different counties and various cities like marked on various like police vans and stuff. Yeah.
So in terms of numbers, I mean, obviously not every person that's going out to protest is affiliated with YLF or taking more of a radical left stance. But I mean, what kind of numbers do you guys have in terms of the people that affiliate with what you're doing?
That's some information that I'd like to keep at least somewhat vague.
But in terms of larger leftist, in terms of like sort of the larger group of organizations that we're all familiar with and involved with in various capacities, we've got a couple dozen people out there at the absolute base minimum of like people that I know personally. And then people who know about us, know about other local leftist groups like the BSA. It's a decent chunk of people that show up consistently.
And how many?
At least in the upper hundreds, all in all.
Okay, so hundreds and hundreds of people. It's not just like a few people. I mean, you have hundreds of people just in your area. So in terms of like where other protesters are in relation to you, I mean, looking at some streams of the protest, some of the reporting that's gone on, obviously there are some people at the protests who are very openly saying, don't use violence, don't use property damage. How many people are sympathetic to where you guys are coming from?
It's hard to say because I think people tend to hide their sympathies, especially when, like, the other night we witnessed like somebody was trying to tag a building and got body slammed by another protester.
So there's like a lot of internal policing that is definitely constricting what people are doing versus like maybe what they would be tolerant of individually.
So what do you think?
It's really hard to.
What do you think about that? I mean, how do you feel about these other protesters that are trying to stop some of what you're doing?
I think that, to some degree, they're trying to play cops. They're trying to police other people's actions. And that's a kind of delicate place to be in because they are not democratically elected to that position. No. There are no agreed upon terms. It's whatever they individually have the personal force to enforce, right?
Yeah.
So
it's really, we've kind of seen a breaking of the unity of the protests, especially kind of the turning point of that was when instead of immediately taking an aggressive posture, being real liberal with the use of the tear gas and all that, the cops decided to just hang back and only kettle surround everyone, move in at midnight or 1 or so.
Once the numbers have dwindled enough that they can just scoop up like 100 or so people.
And then once that happened, we lost, the obvious outside enemy, and people started infighting. And it's been just a ton of infighting since, and it's really hindered things.
And oftentimes that takes the form of like the other day there was like multiple people who were trying to like lead like moments of silence or vigils in various different like wordings of it. Do we lay down on the ground? Do we sit in silence? Is it 1 minute or 9 minutes? It's just, it gets a little convoluted, but that's sort of the issue with a very organic movement like this is once the, if the energy is not directed outwards, it becomes about sort of internal struggles for power.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't sound like from what you guys said that you're much of a fan of like people like laying down on the ground or kneeling or having the police kneel. I mean, how do you operate when there is so much infighting? How do you, deal with all of the, as you say, internal policing?
That's a very hard question to answer, especially since like we aren't in the leadership role here. And I don't know if it's a question that will be able to be answered, at least.
Part of the reason why we aren't necessarily advocating for some of the like lay down in front of the cops kind of tactics is because it gets people hurt.
Yeah.
And part of why we don't want to incite violence is because it gets people hurt. So that's as far as what role it may have in like violence in whatever capacity may have in like spreading a message or what have you, it's the people that are out there right now are prepared for a certain kind of protest, in that they are not they're not like well equipped to handle even tear gas. Often they don't have a lot of eye protection, so I don't feel comfortable advocating for people to get more aggressive.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem that there is different types of protesters, as you're pointing out. Do you feel like this wave of protests, I mean, following the again, what some have called police brutality, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so forth, I mean, is this going to continue for a long time, or is this on the wane, or do you think it's only going to increase in popularity nationally?
I think we're going to find out this weekend.
Yep.
Honestly, because it has become last weekend. It was very intense. It is tempered over the week, but I've heard from a lot of people that are very excited to turn out tomorrow.
Tomorrow being Saturday, just so I can put a marker on where we're talking.
Saturday.
We're talking on Friday, early Friday evening, Mountain time, I guess, Mountain Standard Time. Yeah. So I mean, so you're saying that really Saturday, June 6th is going to really be a major point of.
Yeah, I think that in some cities it's very clear that this has a lot of momentum.
Yeah, we're in a bit of a unique situation where like DPD has kind of decided to
take this kind of unique tactic.
Yeah, where like we haven't seen that in a lot of other places like DC and New York and Minnesota. So we might end up with a pretty significantly different situation here in Denver than other places in the country.
I think, it really depends on how much force the police choose to use tomorrow on Saturday, because last Saturday, it was waves and waves at, midday of like indiscriminate tear gas and rubber bullets towards a bunch of basically entirely peaceful protesters and like homeless people who just happened to live around there.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. That was like a really egregious displays of violence.
Yeah, it's important to understand, just as a bit of a side note, with our Capitol building, the area around that Civic Center Park is a very common place where homeless people camp, and they have been directly in the crossfire.
Yes. Yeah, it's been very hard on them. But so, in contrast, that was what was happening last Saturday. What was happening, like, from what we've seen and heard over the last couple days. It's been a much more tempered approach where they let people do marches in very, very specific kind of areas, and then wait until about midnight to like aggressively kettle people. But if they continue that approach, if they're able to continue that approach on Saturday, I feel like it could probably lead to this kind of waning. Yeah. Whereas if they return to the more aggressive approach, I think it'll continue to escalate.
Yeah, and when they've taken this hands-off approach, that doesn't mean the brutality is stopped.
Yeah.
It just means it's much harder to document and to have a widespread effect.
It's much more covert versus overt.
Yeah, it's like they're brutalizing people after they pick them off.
So you guys mentioned that Saturday is a major day for determining the future of what's going to happen with these protests and the present moment in American society and with the George Floyd protests and everything else. Is there a particular city? I know you mentioned that Denver maybe is not as favorable to what you're doing to protesters, but is there a particular city or particular area or cities that you're aware of where maybe there is more favorable results from your perspective?
That's definitely a tough one to answer because we aren't on the ground there and don't necessarily have super close contact. But I mean, probably the ones with the highest potential are, you know, our standard big cities of obviously Minneapolis. Of course, you can't not talk about Minneapolis and all of this, but also like Chicago, New York, DC, LA. Those seem to be the ones where the most is happening, at least. It's really hard to make any predictions, but
Sure. I mean, so like in Portland, Oregon, and in Seattle, there seem to be large numbers of protesters. But if I'm hearing you correctly, the large numbers of protesters, depending upon the tactics, that may not mean anything for effectiveness.
it certainly helps, and you have to have a large number if you want to do anything. But yeah, numbers alone will not make it an effective or not effective protest. There's a lot more that goes into it, especially like kind of the general sentiment and the leadership.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, I guess that naturally leads into, so what would be effective? Let's say that there are people that you're speaking to, or you're advising, you're put in the position of, hey, you're in this city, in this town, there's maybe a chance to kind of really use the moment. What would you advise them to do? What would be effective?
That's hard, honestly. I guess a lot of what we are doing, like personally, and what other people that are kind of have share goals with us are doing, are just sort of trying to keep the protests from disintegrating into like various inside conflict, or keeping people safe enough to keep showing up, stuff like that, making sure that there's support in terms of like water, stuff like that. I think really helps just organically the interests of the group be expressed outwardly.
Yeah. I think if I had to just like give a piece of advice, I'd have to echo kind of what one of my former teachers, who was a former Panther, told me of. You always have to be thinking about what your next step is. What comes next? Once we do this, once we accomplish this goal that we're working on, what do we do next? And you always need to be asking that. And I don't think we really are right now. The people who are the people who are trying to maintain their power, and they're the ones who are proposing all these reforms and kneeling with the police.
And part of what makes this delicate and difficult is because it does originate from a more racially focused, goal and organization. So there's definitely a lot of push to not have sort of other organizations co-opt it, in like the public's understanding of what co-optation would look like. So, I think that also makes it harder for us to, be on the front lines of directing where efforts should be going. So, it's not impossible, but, it's delicate, and it involves a lot of conversations with other people on the ground.
So, I mean, what are the next steps? I mean, you mentioned, you got to be thinking about the next steps. Presumably, mentioning that, you probably are thinking next steps. So regardless of what happens with this particular moment in time, what are the next steps for your movement, for your group?
I think on a broad scale, a lot of it is going to be making sure that, or doing what we can to make sure that the way that these protests are kind of symbolized in our cultural memory after they're done is that, like, protesting outside of the lines of what's acceptable, not even saying violently, but like going beyond the, scheduled march in a pre-planned route, going beyond that works. There is potential there, but you need to have a organization, you need to have leadership, you need to have real and achievable goals. Like if that's the message that we can get out of this, the having it be a symbol of, okay, we had the start, we just didn't have what it took to take it further, that is probably the best that we could ask for.
Or, if we do continue to take it forward, obviously we're going to continue to advocate through, conversations with, people on the ground, conversations with like labor leaders, and how they like disseminate information to their membership. Like on Saturday, there's going to be a contingent of specifically people that are involved in labor showing up and leading, portions of the protesters, and helping people understand how these issues are connected. I think that's part of the next step in making sure that people understand that this is like this is a problem of capitalism, not an issue that can be quashed through like racial bias training or something. So I do think that integrating labor is going to be a big part of moving this forward.
So I guess it would only be natural, considering that, whether what you're doing is X percentage political, X percentage social, X percentage economic, there is obviously a political element. And you do have a political year, with 2020 being an election year. And most on the left, presumably, would probably support the Democratic nominee, Joe Biden. And he has been, I believe, endorsed by Bernie Sanders, even, whom you both, I think you mentioned y'all were both supportive of. So what is your relationship to the Democratic Party, to Joe Biden, to that whole part of the process? What are your feelings towards that? And do you think you'll end up voting for Joe Biden?
I think it's a mistake to frame some of this in terms of individual choices, because I won't be voting for Biden. Never going to do that. But beyond that, I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours canvassing for Bernie. I taught other people how to canvass. I'm not going to lift a single finger for Biden. I'm going to tell people probably don't bother, and that is, but that is separate from more local politics, which I do think there is potential in. Like we mentioned earlier, like multiple different Denver leftist groups helped elect Candy Sitabaka, who has been like a real asset to all of us. So I think that is probably the focus going forward with like leftist electoral politics, is going to be local, and it's going to be about very local issues. And it should be very specific things that can be accomplished. So that's
speaking on a broader and more abstract level, we don't align ourselves with the Democratic Party. No one on like the illiberal left actively aligns himself with the Democratic Party. At best, they're a vehicle for power, and even then they still have an oppositional relationship to us. They're still a party of capital. And in some ways they're even more dangerous than like the Republicans, where
they serve to diffuse a lot of leftist energy.
And they hide their oppositional relationship with us, where like anyone marginally on the left knows that Republicans aren't their friends, but a lot of those people don't know that Democrats aren't their friends. Like the DNC, the Democratic leadership, uh, 99.9% of the members of the Democratic Party and who are like actual political agents, not talking about just ordinary people. None of them like really care about working class interests, have working class interests. That's not what they're about. They're not on the side of the working class.
So in your view, S and H, does it matter if either Joe Biden, prospective Democratic nominee, a presumptive Democratic nominee, I should say, or Donald Trump wins the presidency in the 2020 election, or does it not matter who wins?
I think you get different answers from different people. To me, I think it's very hard to tell. Largely, nah. There's just no role for the left to play regardless in this. It doesn't matter what our specific like feelings or speculation on it is. There's nothing for us to do in either of these administrations. Our role oppositionally doesn't really even change. It's just sort of, it's out of our purview.
I do think it matters, but it doesn't matter quite as much as people tend to think. Like it is not a life and death thing there, and Joe Biden has kind of his own unique dangers where I do think if he wins, we'll see a lot of people demobilize where they'll think, okay, Trump's not president, I don't have to be involved with politics or social issues anymore. And that, depending on what Joe Biden actually does, could be worse. Like, do we go for kind of the louder danger who might end up doing worse things, or do we go for the quieter one that we then run the risk of him being like just doing comparable evil where like like he can do it and no one will notice.
Interesting. So I mean, would it be your position that, I guess, to have Donald Trump reelected would be a more favorable position for the radical left than to have Joe Biden, who it sounds like you're suggesting isn't really much different in terms of policy?
Possibly. It's hard to tell. That's definitely the feeling of a lot of people. There are plenty of people that do disagree with that, though.
Right. So I guess going forward, I mean, it seems like really in a way we've kind of completed the circle from where we began, because talking about revolutionary change, radical change that you're advocating for, and then kind of coming to a point of saying that at least in this election, you don't see a huge difference between the candidates. I suppose it would be natural then to find out. So if somebody said, okay, they agree with what you're saying, they want to be part of this, they want to be part of that change and be a change agent along with you, how does someone just reach out to you? And I mean, you can't just join the YLF, or can you? I mean, how does that work?
It's a little bit of a process. We have a vetting process. It's nothing crazy though. The best way to contact us is through our Twitter. It's RM_YLF. From there, either just send an email or a DM, and that'll get you added to our communications. And there's a vetting process within that, but it's really just simple as that to get in contact. Twitter is the best way, like I was saying.
So what other, I guess, issues or matters do you feel like ought to be covered with this, or what would you want people to know about what you are doing?
Well, about what we're doing, we're not just here for this. We've been here, we're going to be here after, and we're going to keep engaging in struggles no matter what, really. There is no end in sight. We're not planning on just dropping this when the protests are over or any other time. We're going to be here, and the only way that we're going to win is if we're all doing it together. We need everyone. And this is something that everyone has a stake in.
And so to those who would say, be critical or say, well, these tactics are too extreme. I mean, we've certainly gone through a litany of things. I mean, what would you say to those individuals? Say they're even on the left and they agree with maybe some of the policy changes, but they say, no, some of this is just too far. What would you say to those individuals?
everything kind of seems impossible until it isn't, right? And that I honestly, I hear that less and less
Yeah.
in the past few months, going from, having a, the Democratic frontrunner being someone who describes himself as a socialist, to the pandemic and massive layoffs and widespread, rent strikes and, discussions of labor militancy, to the protests where the masses are very much rising up, So
maybe the question that I would ask is, how many times are you going to let power spit in your eye before you do something about it? Because we are hostages right now. How long are you going to tolerate being a hostage?
Also, the way that demands and negotiation function, you ask for a lot. You don't start yourself off from hemming in what you can accomplish. You aim for as much as possible. So what's the harm?
Yeah.
So I guess as kind of a final question, or what would be the demands, or what would be, if you could see immediate policy changes? I know you mentioned some of the things that you didn't feel were very effective. What do you want to see in the near term, or is there any policy prescription specifically that would be amenable to what you're talking about? Is it only revolutionary change?
I do think massive cuts to the budget of the police would be good. I think allocating that money towards schools and other social supports for communities would be good. I think that passing laws that protect labor unions and workers in general, workers' rights, is key. I think that there's no harm in trying to claw towards whatever we can accomplish in terms of policy, certainly. Yeah.
My answer would be that we still need to survive. We need to keep ourselves and our communities alive, and any policy that will help us do that is something that we should, at the very, very least, be in favor of.
Yes.
Which, significantly cutting the budgets, police, everything like that will help us survive.
Ultimately, though, it's y'all's position that basically you're going to require some kind of revolution for things to really change.
Yeah, for there to be meaningful, lasting change, that to where we can all live with dignity, with full humanity. Yes.
S&H, members of Youth Liberation Front in the Denver area, is there anything else that you want to add or say as we kind of come to a close here?
Don't bring your dogs or kids to these protests.
Oh my God, please don't.
Are people bringing their dogs and kids?
Yes. It's very,
people are bringing their children to the protests.
Yeah.
During the day, and it's gotten less so, honestly, but especially at the beginning when people didn't know what to expect, I think they were bringing dogs and kids, which, we want to keep them safe, and so it's a lot of work. And otherwise, show up. You need to be on the front lines of this. You need to be there. You cannot say that you're making space for Black voice or something. Just show up and put everything you can into it. And be safe. Don't make yourself a liability or burden to others. Look up what you need to do to prepare for tear gas. Bring a good mask, bring enclosed eye protection.
Tear gas is very painful, and you don't want it on your
mucous
insides.
Take care of yourself, take care of other people, and show up.
And that was S&H, members of the Rocky Mountain Youth Liberation Front in the Denver area of Colorado. If you like the show, please subscribe on YouTube or in your favorite podcast app. Leave us a positive review, tell your friends and family. And if you have an idea for a guest, email us at jessfieldsshow@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.